We're going to begin this forum. It may be Wednesday, but we in the panel believe this is perhaps one of the more informative panels that you will have participated in throughout this AUSA week. My name is Mark McCarley, Major General retired, and I am an AUSA Senior Fellow. And as your professional association, the Association of the United States Army is proud to provide these forums, just like this one, throughout the year that broaden the knowledge base of Army professionals and those of you who support our Army. AUSA amplifies the U.S. Army's narrative to audiences inside of the Army and helps to further the association's mission to be the voice of the Army support for the soldier. Now, of course, we can't do this alone, and AUSA relies on its members, you, to help tell the Army story and to support our soldiers and their families. A strong membership base is vitally important for our advocacy efforts in Congress, the Pentagon, and the Defense Industrial Base, and as well to the public in communities across this country through AUSA's 122 chapters, both within the United States and other countries. So again, thank you for your continued support of AUSA. Now, if you are a new member of AUSA, you were inspired this week to put down the small amount of cash and join our team. We want you to learn about AUSA, and if you want, after the conclusion of this session, to upgrade your membership status from basic to premium, be sure to visit AUSA's membership booth. It's located in the West Salon across from the registration, or simply visit ausa.org. Now, I have in my hands, this is a gift, and each one of our panelists, our distinguished panelists, will receive this. And so I say, on behalf of General Brown, our President and CEO, and the rest of our AUSA team, here is a small token, ladies and gentlemen, of our appreciation for your time and commitment. We appreciate you being here today. And now it is my distinct honor to turn it over to our moderator, Ms. Catherine Kuzminski, and she is the Director of Military, Veterans, and Society Programs for the Center for the New American Security. Ms. Kuzminski, it's all yours.
All right, thank you so much. A couple comments up top for our audience. So you'll find cards on your chairs. If you would like to submit a question for our Q&A session, feel free to fill that out. There'll be uniforms in the audience collecting them, and if you need another card, let us know. We'll also have microphones up here at the front when we shift to the Q&A time. So thank you to AUSA, and welcome everyone here to CMF 5, Strengthening the Army Profession for 2030 and Beyond. As I think you will hear repeatedly on this panel isn't just directly connected to the Chief of Staff of the Army's 4 main focus areas. I would dare to say that this is the most important one on which the rest of them rely. As General Bordeaux and my other fellow panelists will address in further detail, professionalism in the United States Army demands character, competence, and commitment from our soldiers. The U.S. Army's professionalism provides a distinct comparative advantage when we look at our near-peer adversaries. They can study our technology, they can even study our tactics, but they cannot replicate our people. So how did we get here? On July 1st of this year, the United States recognized 50 years of the all-volunteer force, and the question of the professionalism of the force was very present at the inception of the modern AVF. The Gates Commission wrestled with the question of how you could get and develop a professional volunteer force, and we're still working through those questions now. So how can we measure the profession of the force? Well, over the last 5 decades, we've seen some real innovation. We've seen the shift from times-based standards in training to standards-based training. We've seen an expansion of professional military education, not just for our officer corps, but a real professionalism in our NCO corps. We've seen an increase in intellectual aptitude and educational attainment among the force. And more recently, we've seen changes to the command assessment program, which is really taking a novel approach to not just seeing a lack of character as a detractor from command, but actually using those intangible skills, making them tangible, and deciding our command slate based on those skills in addition to our hard skills. Why does it matter? It's no surprise to any of us that operationally we face a major challenge. We are looking to the Indo-Pacific as the pacing threat. And what will be required of our soldiers may look different than what we've experienced over the last 20 years. We might be operating in a comms-degraded environment, and professionalism will be infused through our force down the echelons, down to even the company level, where we might require a small unit to sustain the joint fight. Individuals will be required to lean on their training, their experience, and their unit cohesion, which all flow from professionalism. Domestically, it's no secret to any of us that the recruiting environment has been challenging for the last few years for all of the services. And part of that has to do with a lack of exposure to those who are in service, as we see older generations of veterans from the draft era passing away. So it's quite possible that a soldier in this room is the only exposure that someone in their hometown or when they're traveling may encounter. And the nation's youth and their parents need to trust that the Army is a professional and trustworthy institution, and you all and the Army profession stands out in front leading that fight. So now I will introduce our esteemed panelists. I'm thrilled to be joined by General Gary Brito, the 18th Commanding General of TRADOC.
Well, I had a good job for a minute.
Promotion. We're also joined by Deputy Undersecretary of the Army, Mr. Mario Diaz. Lest our force comrades in the room feel left out, we are also joined by the Command Sergeant Major of ForceCom, Sergeant Major Holland. And lastly, we are joined by Dr. Jeffrey Peterson, Director of the Superintendent's Character Integration Advisory Group at the United States Military Academy. So thank you all for joining me. I'm going to hand it down the line for each of you to give brief remarks and then turn over a question to each of you, and then we'll open it up for the audience Q&A. So General Brito.
Hey, thank you, Kate. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. It's indeed an honor to be here with you today to talk about our Army profession. Our Army profession reinforces who we are. And more importantly, I would offer, it reinforces what we owe America and what we owe those moms and dads that give us as soldiers that we have an honor the privilege to serve. It is also about having war fighting and skill proficiency at whatever you do, so that when called upon, and we will, and we always have, over 248 years, we fight, win, come back, and bring our soldiers home. And that warfighting skill proficiency and warfighting proficiency and skill proficiency, whether you're an infantry soldier or a cook, is important. And we infuse everything we can into that to deploy, fight, and win and come back. And that's we owe America, period, in many senses. Our profession of arms is also families that are taken care of, families that are cared for, single soldiers that are cared for, and everything we can do for their families. It's about strong teams and supported family members. And it's also important that we reinforce the characteristics of character, competence, and commitment. We'll talk about all three of those throughout the questions and answers today. Character, competence, and commitment. And I would add the importance of professional culture for the soldiers that serve, infused with trust, dignity, and respect, and proficiency of what we require them to do so we can deliver what we need to do for our country. Thank you. Looking forward to the questions and answers later on. Sure.
Well, great. Thank you, General Brito. It's great to see so many folks here this morning to talk about and dialogue on this important topic. I'm truly honored to be here. I'm truly honored to be on the stage here with such a great group of professionals. who I've known for a long, long time, some of them, and happy to be here to represent a civilian perspective from the point of view when we look at the Army profession and the role that civilians play. And please don't let the hair gel or the suit fool you. I did serve for 30 years, though, and I'd be happy to talk about the profession of arms, and I do think it has an important role as we build up to look at the greater profession within the Army, but I'm going to focus my attention today on civilians' participation in their role. And I think it's a first-order question. Are civilians part of the Army profession? And as we look to strengthen it, what role will civilians play in that? Now, if you want to look at it from a classic Samuel Huntington perspective, in The Soldier and the State, the profession of arms, as Huntington addressed, didn't necessarily include civilians. And Huntington spoke about corporateness, expertise, and responsibility, and I would add authority. And that's what a profession of arms brings to, in our case, our nation. And I think that that's an important point of view. But that was written in 1957, almost 7 years ago. And as we look to the future and how warfighting has continued to evolve, how our version of the way, as Kate highlighted, how we bring our values, not just in terms of technology and our leadership, but our ethics, our morals, and the way that we prosecute the fight. And it's so important as we consider the events that are going on in the Middle East at this time. It's so important that we reassess. And as we look forward to what warfare and what the impacts of civilians will have on the way that we view the Army as a profession, I think it's important because the security environment is changing and the participation of those that are prosecuting activities in that environment are a little bit different. We know that there's an increased role of cyber professionals, increased role of space, and that particular capability that we are continuing to build. We also have some enduring capabilities that we bring as civilians, as professionals, in terms of civil works, and the acquisition process is primarily a civilian-led entity. But it does have an impact on our greater Army profession, so I think that we need to consider that as we go forward. So what is my hypothesis on this particular question with regards to do civilians play a role in the Army profession, and how do they strengthen it? And I think this: Army civilians are professionals because they are composed of a unique body of experts that are certified in the design, generation, and support, and when required, shape the ethical application of land power. And they're entrusted by our population to defend the Constitution and the rights of our citizens. I think that hypothesis needs to continue to be assessed and tested, but there's no doubt that the civilian professionals play a role as we strengthen the Army profession. I look forward to discussing it more because it's so important as we go forward. I'll just give you one data point. Out of all the civilian professionals within the Army, over 225,000 of them, 19% of them are 35 years and younger. So they will be actively involved in this strengthening the profession, and I think it's important dialogue. Thank you.
All right.
Good morning, everybody. Command Sergeant Major T.J. Holland, United States Army Forces Command. The profession, the expertise and competence that is applied, embodied, and validated through education and experience. The discipline of warfighting. The Army's profession is built on specialized knowledge and skills related to fighting and winning our nation's wars. Commitment to duty, ethics, and the development of leaders and units to accomplish their mission is essential to developing a warrior mindset. Forces Command priorities are focused to deliver readiness for warfighting. We validate those in FORSCOM's combat training centers and TRADOC's warfighter exercises. They both provide us a measure of performance to help develop our professional expertise, which really comes in a continuum of lifelong learning. When every young enlisted soldier starts our journey in initial entry training to learn how to be a soldier, transition to advanced individual training for developing MOS competencies, and in that symbiotic relationship between Forces Command and TRADOC, where we're balancing operational experience and validate those experiences in that training and our professional military education. Capping that all off, you never stop learning. Leader development is imperative. It's who we are. Leaders make leaders. Some of the initiatives that TRADOC has developed and we're applying in Forces Command and Operational Force, you think about the individual development plan, coached and mentored at our PME by instructors in TRADOC, and built to identify what is measurable and achievable for helping that soldier achieve their goals. We're moving that along. That you're seeing this year is another pilot from TRADOC and Forces Command, the June Enlisted Assessment Report, to start to build that culture of lifelong assessments. That symbiotic relationship goes forward in our doctrine. As Future Command looks at that next fight of 2030 and 2040, we're keeping our eye on the ball now. So between TRADOC and Forces Command, it's how we fight in the future. As we bring new technologies and new tactics, techniques, and procedures that call us looking at our CTCs, we're experimenting, and the warfighters, is making sure our doctrine is moving at the speed of relevance. Right? There's 0 mills between FORSCOM and TRADOC on this. That self-accountability, as far as the profession, specifically with the NCO Corps, is we are the backbone. Our commanders empower non-commissioned officers because we are trusted. That trust is built every day, and every day is selection. Because presence matters, and leadership is the most decisive element of combat power. Just remember that. And it's our responsibility as non-commissioned officers, from sergeant to command sergeant major, we're responsible for training, enforcing standards and discipline. It's grounded in our policy and in our doctrine. We have to use our rank for good, because we are professionals, we are leaders, we are non-commissioned officers. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
All right, and Dr. Peterson.
Well, good morning. I'm Dr. Jeff Peterson. I'm here from the United States Military Academy at West Point. It's a great honor to be on this panel today. I was going to start off with a joke about my hair gel. Doesn't quite work out for me, so.
Well done.
But what I'd like to say is that my perspective on this is a little bit different, in that West Point is the entry point for some of the officers that join the United States military. And so our mission is to educate, train, and inspire the Corps cadets so that each graduate is a commissioned leader of character. We have 47 months to transform a group of about 1,200 young men and women into trusted Army professionals that are prepared to build and lead cohesive teams. This is not really a small task. And you've heard mentioned already that trust in our profession is a function of character, competence, and commitment. It's not really hard to convince people that competence is an essential part of profession. It's a little bit different challenge to talk about character and commitment as part of that trust. So we have a really important job to, over these 47 months, transform the identity of a young man or woman into the Army profession. And so one of the things I think we need to remember is there is a bit of a back to basics approach here. There is no silver bullet to this. This requires consistent effort, consistent discussion, and consistent prioritization on adhering to Army values and living by our ethic, and always asking if what we're doing is building trust or undermining trust, no matter what the task. General Dempsey at one point was an author of a white paper on the Army profession, and in that paper he said, "We are not a profession just because we say we are. We are only a profession if we live up to the expectations, the full expectations of what it means to be a professional." So back to this idea of character, competence, and commitment. In the press of everyday life, competence tends to rise to the top. That's where we spend our attention, and for good reason. I'm not trying to say that competence isn't important, but it's urgent, it's easier to measure than things like character and commitment, so we tend to pay more attention to it. And I think if we take the other two for granted, we set ourselves up for failure. We have to pay as much attention to them as we do the competence piece of our profession. Just a little mental exercise. Try to imagine what would happen to trust if we got rid of any one of those three C's. You can be really competent, You can have pretty good character, but if you're not committed to the mission, to the organization, to your unit, then you're probably not going to be trustworthy, because when the chips are down, you're going to be looking out for yourself more than you are your soldiers, your unit, or the mission. And you can go through that exercise on any combination of two or even one and recognize that if you violate one of those three C's, you are no longer trustworthy and you've undermined the status of the profession. And this is absolutely critical. Another great scholar in the field of professions is Dr. Don Snyder. And in his words, trust is the currency of the profession. The trust that he's talking about, there's two types of it. There's the external trust, the trust with the American public, with our civilian leaders, that they trust us to fulfill our responsibilities. But then there's also internal trust within the formation. But in both, trust involves the reality that there is a vulnerability that people are exposing themselves to and expect somebody else to cover for that vulnerability. For America, we need national security. America is vulnerable to attack in all kinds of different domains. They trust the military and the Army to cover that vulnerability. Soldiers within a formation are vulnerable to the orders of their leaders and to the actions of their peers. And so they trust their peers and their leaders to not exploit those vulnerabilities. So I'd just like to close with my opening comments here with this idea that we cannot afford to compartmentalize competence, character, and commitment. When we go on any particular endeavor in the Army, training, whatever it is that we're doing, we should always think through this lens of how can I develop not just competence, but also integrate the character and the commitment piece into it as well. That's the only way we're going to sustain it, so that we can ensure that the trust is present that makes our profession effective. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you. So I'm going to pose a question to each of our panelists, and then we'll turn to the audience for Q&A. So again, if you want to submit a question, or if you want to head up to the mics, we'll let you know at the appropriate moment. I'm going to start with General Brito and Command Sergeant Major Holland. Looking at current initiatives, what is one initiative underway that you see as vital to building the profession for 2030 and beyond? So I'll turn to you, General.
Well, I would like to add that we have always focused on having a strong Army profession, always. But we've also seen some things we can be with an adaptive Army, and we continue to learn. One program we're reinvigorating is our professional writing opportunities. And I offer those as opportunities because we have some really smart folks in the Army of all ranks. And through our professional journals and opportunities to submit good ideas, lessons learned, all of that can be shared as an opportunity for our soldiers of all ranks and our civilian professionals to continue to learn. So we're reinvigorating that and looking at the technology that we have that's out there to infuse that as well. I can go back to my second lieutenant days, picking up what was the infantry magazine was the way to go, and that was a journal. Now today, maybe hitting something on your iPhone is also a way to get to that. So that's one opportunity. And I also credit the great leaders out there in their innovative ways to adapt their training to yet build that strength in the basic blocking and tackling of their warfighting skills that I mentioned in my opening remarks, Kate. And I can't underscore how important that is. You may do a range differently, you may tackle the rifle range differently, or do your physical fitness training differently, but you are building the strong brick and mortar basic blocking and tackling from which you can continue to get better and better and better at every echelon throughout the continuum of training that our soldiers come back at. PFC today, Sergeant tomorrow, Sergeant First Class later. Second Lieutenant today, Captain tomorrow, Major later. And it's a continuum of professional growth and development that feeds into our profession, to include taking care of our families and more. I could go on all day, but I'll share some stage time with my Sergeant Major down there. Sergeant Major.
Yeah.
Thanks, ma'am. I would say the culture of assessments is going to kind of change our Army as far as holding ourselves accountable to what the standard is, right? The Army standard. You know, if our nation expects much of us, right, to fight and win our nation's wars, to maintain that standard, we have to have a way to hold ourselves accountable, be above reproach. And I think what we're seeing, at one point we had put more time, focus, and energy on assessing whether a soldier could join the Ranger Regiment than we did actually lead large formations in our Army. So the Command Assessment Program, the Sergeant Major Assessment Program, the new JIR that's coming out, it affords us the opportunity to really develop leaders of the future, because that's kind of like one of those our inherent responsibilities as leaders in the Army right now is build the next generation of leaders. And we want the right ones, and we're on the X for that. So we have a responsibility to make sure that we're developing those junior leaders that are going to lead us tomorrow in the future.
That's great. Mr. Diaz, you rightly noted that the Army profession is not just those in uniform, that we rely on a cadre of civilian leaders. Can you speak a bit to how we're selecting and preparing our future Army civilian leaders?
Great, Kate. Yeah, absolutely. As a matter of fact, I this morning spoke to over about almost 200 of the SESs that were present here in the conference. We have 270 SESs in the Army. Did y'all know that? I didn't when I was in your shoes, but I do know now. And they are critical to, like flag officers, carrying the guidance and implementing actions and policies. So I challenge them and let them know that they have a role in strengthening the Army profession. They have to understand at their level, with their organization or their unit, how are they going to implement it and what they're going to put into place. I also think, too, that we need to have a longitudinal view of it. General Brito spoke about, the career progression from whether on the NCO track, from private to sergeant major or lieutenant to captain to field grade or flag officer. I think that there's a similar type of progression we have to have within the civilian education. We have to incorporate our PMEs, our War College. Dave Hill is here from the Army War College. I think that if we don't look at specifically how do we look at historically and then implementation or action plans for the civilians, then we'll be left kind of as an afterthought to it. And I think that we also need to look at some foundational ways to implement that as part of this overall process that the chief has charged us to focus in on. Because if we don't, we will go back to the norm, which is very important, which is look at it from a profession of arms and not realize that there's some unique characteristics, unique attributes. We talk about the 3 C's a lot here, and that's critically important. I would add 2 more C's when you're talking about civilians and the Army profession that they take part in and strengthen it. The first one is continuity. The civilian professionals add a level of continuity to organizations and institutions that we just can't have because of the continuing, rightfully so, process of rotating uniform leaders and positions. And the second one is comprehensiveness. They add a level of breadth and depth to organizations to either reinforce a capability or in some cases where we don't have the senior level uniform capability to provide leadership, that we have civilian leaders providing organizational leadership over definite aspects of not just civilians, but military leaders and organizations that are composed of military formations underneath them. So they have to be involved in that as well. And I just really think that if we look at it lastly, we have multiple ways that people become Army civilians. So as we look at that process and those multiple entree points as they become civilians, we have to be cognizant of making sure that they understand the Army values, understand the Army culture, and look for ways to make sure that we just don't have gaps in that entry process. Because you can become an Army civilian through the normal progression and entry level and serve for 30 to 40 years as an Army civilian. You can come in like a lot of Army civilians do, laterally from industry or from other portions of the government. Or you can do like some of us have done, matriculate from the military on the uniform side and become civilians. Each of those, I think, are a unique perspective, and we need to make sure that they for lack of a better term, that we standardize and optimize the way that we make sure that they understand their role in the profession.
That's great. Dr. Peterson, you're in a unique position of preparing our cadets for future leadership in the real Army, which sometimes is a surprise to them when they get to the real Army. So thinking through the characteristics that you see as vitally important and thinking through their professional military education side of the house and their overall education, what's one of those characteristics that you really work on honing up at the Academy?
So I think there's probably two or three that rise to the very top of what we attempt to develop in terms of character. The first is they go to West Point and they get a world-class education. So one of the first things we want them to have is this intellectual virtue of critical thinking. So that's an absolute essential to being successful in today's Army. I mean, the fact is we're not going to be able to predict the situations that they will be in. We can prepare them as much as we possibly can, but we really need to give them that intellectual virtue of critical thinking so that they approach each problem in a methodical way. The second is a pretty basic value, and the Army values its integrity, but we call it honesty. We have to be honest about everything. We have to be honest when we counsel people. We have to be honest about our own capabilities. We have to be honest about our reports for readiness. And basic honesty is really a foundation of making sure that we have shared understanding so that we can execute mission command. If we shade the truth or take shortcuts to make us look a little better than we might be, then that's going to be a problem. So we really emphasize the honesty. And then the third one, and this one's a little more difficult to measure, but it's this idea of judgment, of practical wisdom. So this is a meta virtue in the basic structure of virtue ethics. The Aristotle word for it is phronesis. But the idea is that you have practical wisdom, which is you can figure out what's going on around you, understand all the trade-offs, all the competing demands, and then decide and make the best judgment that you possibly can with the information you have, and you do it in a way that demonstrates your character, your commitment, and your competence. That's essentially what officers and non-commissioned officers, any Army leader has to do. You have to think your way through a problem, you have to be honest about the situation, and then you got to exercise your judgment to make a decision and act. And so those are really the three things that we focus on the most.
Kate, may I
Yes,
add to
please.
that? Our 41st Chief mentioned last night, and other senior leaders have as well, how the character of war has changed a bit. Mm-hmm. So pulling on all that Dr. Peterson just mentioned, and as he mentioned, applies to our officers, our civilians, our soldiers of all aspects, they should be expected in our ability to have the overmatch, which we will, as the character of war changes against our adversaries, to have the critical thinking skills, all that he just mentioned. And go back to some of the initial questions you brought in. That must be infused in the training we do on that first layer of readiness, the warfighting skills that are necessary at all ranks, all echelons, regardless of the commissioning source, so that we have that overmatch. We defeat the character of war and always stay ahead of it. So great point, Tim.
I'm going to turn to some of the audience questions. Thank you to those who have submitted already. This one I'll direct to General Brito, but anyone else who'd like to jump in. So this is from Mike Meese. A key to the profession is effective talent management so we can retain and employ these professionals. What is the Army doing to institutionalize talent management, including the Brigade and Battalion Command Evaluation Program, so that the Army does not backslide on the talent management side of the house?
I feel pretty comfortable that we're not going to backslide, Mike, and thanks. That's a very good question. And I feel fortunate to have had a previous job where we worked Army talent management, and it is key. Not only in a formal institutionalized program, you mentioned the great value out of the variety of command assessment programs, both for our officers acquisition officers, medical, the non-commissioned officers as well. It's going in about its 5th year and showing some great things for our United States Army, but also a level of ownership in the units at developing those leaders, the corporals that become the sergeants, and lieutenants become the captains as well, and identifying the knowledge, skills, and behaviors that might fit somebody best in their respective job. You mentioned recruiting up in the beginning. Using some of what has worked very well for our talent management, in addition to feedback from the field, we are identifying those best leaders that can be the best recruiters or the best station commanders, just an example. So I'm pretty comfortable on the focus of the institutionalized programs through Army G1 and HRC and others, reinforced by the dialogue with the field. Sergeant Major mentioned the CTC program. We'll work with them to find the best senior trainer because he or she has the street creds and experience to do best at that. And I do expect that level of continued focus will give us the overmatch we need and the right leaders at all echelons in our formations.
Anyone else?
Yeah, thanks. I think it's unbelievable to see what the Army has done for our command accession program. So much so, I've been in the job now for 2 years, and it's taken some time to be able to apply some of those lessons and procedures to the civilian side, SES in particular, but we're focused on that. And so we just finished last month really a revitalized, reinvigorated talent management and succession planning board process. And it was like the CAP program, it involves a significant commitment of time from senior officials to be present, to participate over a 4-day period for 8 hours a day, to go over approximately 250 SES evaluations, packets, and then to provide comprehensive and bespoke or personalized feedback to each of them. Frankly, we used to phone that process in. They would get readiness evaluations back, and they would be almost form letters. So when I saw that, I said, we can't do that. So we spent a significant amount of time with a board of great senior executives that knew those individuals or relied on the evaluations and provided detailed feedback on the status of their development and likely opportunities for them. And we built a slate for each of the 250 or so SESs on their next jobs. That process is important, and it involves a significant amount of candor to provide back to them to say, here's where we see you. And it's not something that is generic, and it's not something that is checking the block. It is detailed and is specific, and I think that that's what we owe. We'd love to continue and try to get a little bit more rigor into the process to do something like the CAP, but right now that's the process, and I think if we don't do that, then you don't have a professionalization, selection, and management process.
It's an element of transparency with that question is we're not done, right? Transforming the Army is one of those 4 focus areas. So we're learning a ton from the command assessment program, right? It's informed us, but we're not done with that program. It's like all things, nothing's perfect, right? But we're tirelessly working to make that thing as best as we can to make sure we have the right talent at the right location, leading the right formation. I think that's important to recognize.
So I'll remind those of you in the audience, if you'd like to come up to the microphones to ask a question, you're welcome to get in line now. I'll remind you, please form your question in the form of a question. I'm going to turn one more question over to Dr. Peterson before we go to the microphones. So given that the bulk of the Army Officer Corps is actually trained in ROTC or OCS, what is it that the Military Academy can provide to the broader officer development pipeline for professionalism?
So it's a great question. We actually have pretty good relationships with Cadet Command and with the agencies in charge of Officer Candidate School. In many ways, it's really about best practices, the things that we can experiment with and we can try at West Point. Sometimes things work, sometimes they don't, but those things that seem to gain some traction on this identity transformation, those things we export to our fellow commissioning sources, and we do so freely. And also, we learn a lot from them. So this combination, or this conversation, is a two-way conversation where we both benefit from it. We have several different sort of character development initiatives, primary prevention initiatives, coursework and training scenarios on this concept of officership as a capstone course for our first class, our senior cadets. And so we have quite a bit of exchange back and forth on exporting ideas of best practices for both.
Great. We'll go to the far mic.
Thank you, ma'am. Major Myron Bishop, Deputy G1, Michigan Army National Guard. My question is related to the assessment program and or assessment programs and whether or not there's discussion of integrating the Guard and Reserve into those programs, for example, CCAP and BCAP, even if it's just informative, you know, may not necessarily need to inform command selection like CSL, but even if a future battalion commander can see some blind spots, it might be very helpful for Guard and Reserve leaders to go through that, go through those types of programs. Thank you.
Okay. I'll take the first stab.
All right.
I do know there has been some discussion on that, and I will say over the years that the CAP programs have happened, it shows how we're adaptive. Initially, it focused on the battalion and colonel level command, expanded to our acquisition civilians and medical professionals as well. So yes, although they may not be happening yet, I do see opportunities for that. And speaking with the respective component commanding generals, there'll have to be some tailored assessment windows, of course, to get exactly what you're just saying, whether it's select a commander or command sergeant major, or something that could get at the attributes you're talking about to perform well in in those lanes. So yes, opportunity, and I showed you adaptive moments that we've had over the last 4 years. I think we can get there.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Go here in the middle.
Thanks. Good morning, and what a wonderful panel to be joining in talking about strengthening the Army. My name is Mike Arnold, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Talent Management Task Force. I've had the privilege of working with a great team of professionals across our human capital enterprise for 5 years. So getting kind of that continuity, Mr. Diaz, you were talking about. You know, as we've piloted and prototyped a number of things working with our Army, it's become apparent to me that as the change agent, the process of doing what many of you spoke about this morning is lengthy. You know, we are a large bureaucracy, over 1.3 million people. We talk about theorizing, educating, operationalizing, and integrating. I've heard comments from the panel today touching on all those themes. Inherently, task forces are temporary. And so we're at the end. My question to the panel is, as we look into the future for 2030 and 2040, there are many moves afoot to take the temporary nature of the Talent Management Task Force and build some sort of smaller, more agile, permanent structure within the Army to help innovate and integrate. I'm wondering, and Sergeant Major, you alluded to it, we're not done yet. So do you believe on the panel, and this is for anybody, that we still have the appetite? A lot of times in my experience, change is hard, and leaders demand change to happen quick. But in the process of translating the work that we do, it takes a little bit of time. Do we still have an appetite to work through some of these initiatives that we've started and to continue to build on what we've already accomplished to do even more things? Again, this goes, Mr. Diaz, to your comment about our civilians, Sergeant Major, about what we're doing in CAP. That seems to be the one that we go to all the time. But tons more assessment work that we could do to have a more granular, detailed understanding of an individual's KSBs. So I'm looking forward to your responses to this, as it's right in my lane, and you know, I have a lot of optimism about where we're going to go in the future based on what we've been able to accomplish collectively in the past. Thank you.
You want to go first?
I'll definitely phone a friend on this and share with my panel members. But thanks, Mr. Arnold. I want to start with answer with something you said in the very beginning on seeing what we might need for Army 2030 and 2040 and beyond. And not to get geeky on you, but I think you bring up a very important point where we may see that we need skill sets or add some proficiency in the MOSs that we already have and capabilities that will require ways to look at how we do talent management, things we need to be innovative with, things we need to experiment with. I'll just pick one. We may see that we need a cyber warrior that we don't have today. and look for those key skills and attributes to build them in soldiers or leaders that we have, or bring them from the street, or something like that, or incentives, or how do we develop that warrant officer to be the technical expert. All of which you've shown in the last couple of years that the task force has been working. Now, much of that can hopefully be institutionalized in our existing formations, but I'm very confident if our senior leaders see a need to go outside of that norm, to find the talent or experiment with something and use technology, we're going to do that to ensure that we have those capabilities for 2030 and 2040, all of which you demonstrated in the last couple of years with the task force. I'll share with my battle buddies for more.
I'll go a little bit and reinforce General Brito. First, to commend you and the work that you've done in providing that continuity, Mr. Arnold, to the Talent Management Task Force. And a lot of the genesis of ideas and theory behind some of this is directly related to the great work that you did and helped us implement. And we're looking forward to having you remain on in a capacity that can continue to shape that. I think, as General Brito said, we have to balance out, just like we did with some of the rapid equipping and other things that we did in a quick turn to get ready for and fight in the global war on terrorism, but then they eventually were incorporated into our systems and organizations and processes within the larger Army. We saw that's the way that things have to continue on, because task forces, as you described, are inherently temporary. However, again, as General Brito said, and is really what is really evidenced by what we're doing with the restructuring of our recruiting command and the organization and reporting directly to the chief and those types of things. I don't think that anything is off the table if we want to, or if we feel that there is a challenge of things being institutionalized and having that institutionalization have a negative connotation with access and authorities and other types of things. So I think we have to strike that balance and figure out that maybe there is a portion of that gets incorporated into our human resource command entities and activities, but there is still some direct activity and access to the senior leaders to be agile enough to make sure that we're not losing the opportunity to get that information to them so they could make change if necessary.
I think it's important to understand, identify, acquire, develop, and retain talent. So you think about all those critical MOSs, whether enlisted, warrant officer, and officer, that we're always striving to retain right after we've poured a lot of training and education into them. And they're so talented that our industry partners want to acquire that talent. So there's that fight for that talent across the Department of Defense, really. If you look at the future 2030, 2040, and you look at the future of tech craft, right, whether it's something that's not inherent in our formations right now, whether it's coding on the edge, some of the things we're learning with AFC in the software factory, some of the lessons observed that we're seeing in other theaters with other armies. How do we identify those knowledge, skills, behaviors in our formation? How do we track that, and how do we employ that talent? Is it a new MOS? Is it a new career field? Well, I would say that's something that Futures Command is also looking at as an ACOM, which owns one of those four buckets that the chief kind of put out there, those four focus areas as far as transform our Army. They're looking at that horizon, and that's where that relationship, not just between FORSCOM and TRADOC becomes imperative, but also all the ACOMs really, as FORSCOM kind of identifies that need, and we come back to TRADOC to develop the requirement and the training pattern, and then Forces Command to employ it, right? So it's enduring, sir.
So one thing I'd like to add to the discussion about the talent management is we talk about KSAs, and this is one of those examples where the knowledge and skills is really, they're easier to identify and to match to particular job requirements. But sometimes I think we might not pay as close attention to the attributes as maybe we should, at least not early in the process. So attributes have become an essential part of the BCAP program, but this is later on in the career. If we can start that earlier, where we're looking at the leader requirements model, looking at the character aspects of that leader requirements model, the be and the know, the interpersonal skills, the self-management, these attributes that are essential to being a contributing member of the profession, I think we should try to bring earlier into the process.
Go here to the middle.
Good morning. Sergeant Major Barker from the 18th Airborne Corps. I think I haven't been part of the command assessment program since the inception, seeing the development. I think it's been a huge impact, positive impact on our Army. My concern, though, is now as we look towards a new generation of leaders coming in that entered service under a blended retirement program. My fear is that potentially we're going to be in a competition to retain that talent, because that security on the back end of a 20-year retirement is no longer there for them, and they have to weigh their benefits of financial security versus their desire to serve. So I guess my question is, what are we looking to do to account for that, to ensure we can continue to maintain that best talent in our ranks?
I can start, I guess. Well, fair concern, Sergeant Major, and we're also looking at the impacts of the blended retirement system on our younger leaders and non-commissioned officers as they grow up. I shouldn't say grow. Longitudinal data for the most part. But I think there's a component, might be hard to put a metrics on it, that's going to help us. And that when you get to that point when you want to command and you want to serve, you just that. You want to command, you want to serve. And the value of the money that you could get at 20 or you continue on, you want to have that call to service to command and serve. I think our assessment program may adapt to ensure that we bring up those right leaders. But I'd like to pull just 10 more seconds. We have CAP at one end. Let's walk it all the way back along the career-long development that we'll expect to give our soldiers and our leaders, our non-commissioned officers and our sergeants. Developing from the captain level, SLC level as well, to be that person that's going to command well at the brigade or battalion level. And just kind of envision a process or an end state where CAP, I don't want to call it just an exercise, but it's just a point along your career-long development because he or she has been developed all the way. I'm not going to say that the retirement at 20 years and 1 month will make a difference, or getting out at 16 because I have it there. We'll always have to wrestle with that. That's just part of our environment. But I think we'll build that grist of a leader, just like yourself, that wants to serve.
No.
Phone a friend.
I would say, and Brian, we've talked about this before, right? It's a tough one. The problem problem right now, you can't see yourself because you can't really measure it yet.
Yeah.
Right. That's a bit of a challenge for us. So it's a little bit intuitive, right? It comes off experience. We've only been doing this for a few years, so can we say we're experienced here yet? Gut instinct. We have a lot of good leaders that are, and we had a task force trying to get after this real quick. I do think some of the changes we're looking at making, and I would tell you from somebody who's been on both sides of that blind curtain, what's so powerful is the feedback, because it's a gift, right? And I think that's probably something we're looking at taking a hard look at, is post-assessment, getting really down into like the feedback, so the leader comes away from that experience motivated to continue to achieve success and realize their goals. So I think we kind of owed them a little bit more than that, to kind of reaffirm that trust with the profession.
It's a great question. Thank you.
If I could add just one aspect to that. So it's very difficult when the Army starts competing in the labor market based purely on pay. But we have something in this profession that money can't buy. And that's why this panel, I think, is so important. The intrinsic value of the profession, of being a professional that is in a profession that is contributing to something bigger than themselves. This is a very appealing idea to this younger generation. And it's appealing to most of the people in this room. So I think one of the challenges we have is we have to make sure that our younger leaders, our younger soldiers are in fact experiencing those intrinsic values that come along with being in this profession. And so we have to make sure that we have the right climates, that we have the right culture, that we're harnessing that talent that we're so closely managing, and we allow it to flourish. Because if we don't do that, if we don't make our members of the profession proud and joyful in being in the profession, then they are going to look for alternatives. And it's going to be very difficult to keep them if we end up competing solely on money, retirement plans, and everything else.
I've been doing a bit of work with the Marine Corps Talent Management Task Force looking at this very specific question. First of all, we're 3 years out from seeing what the data will look like, and so that's one of the big looming questions that we have. But a couple of points. One is, kids now are being asked by their parents when they get a job offer, does it have a retirement plan, yes or no? But they don't necessarily know the value of a military retirement, even under BRS, which is significantly better than what they're probably going to find in a 401k in the private sector. And to that private sector point, we saw a major transformation in the 80s and the 90s from the pension plan for most employees to a 401k program. And what we saw is that employers actually had to manage their people very differently, right? We had to match those knowledge, skills, and behaviors to the desires of individuals in the workforce as they progress through their career development. And I think a number of the initiatives underway within the Army are providing that professional development plan that they're not necessarily going to find outside the Army. We'll go back here to the middle.
Good morning. Gil Sanborn, Civilian Aide to the Secretary of the Army for Northern California. And this is a question for Dr. Peterson. Good to see you again, Jeff.
Yes, sir. Good to see you.
I serve on my Military Academy nominating committee, so we're getting tuned up to interview candidates in December. And if anyone wants to renew their faith in the youth of America, just look at these candidates coming through. They're just extraordinary. Although my card says I report to the Secretary of the Army, my soul says I report to parents of people we send into uniform. And when people research, if they want to really look at the academy, if they go on the Department of Education website in California, they'll come up with one article on the academy, and that is the cheating scandal. That's the only article there. And then I've had questions about the report that came in recently about the increase in sexual harassment at the academy. So to me, there are two things. There's the substance and what we're doing with the substance, and then there's the appearance and how the media exploits and expands that appearance, or the appearance of these dynamics. Could you address both of those, Dr. Peterson, in terms of just how that is being dealt with at the academy level, and then how we can better portray the 99% of the academy that represents all the values that you're talking about?
All right, so it is good to see you, sir, again, and thank you for the question. West Point gets asked this question quite a bit because of the expectations of the institution. Bad news travels quickly and it lasts a long time. And so there's a couple ways that we do our best to try to manage the impact of these particular stories. I have no problem, we have no problem with the high expectations, but it is important to remember the age group that we're dealing with, where they are in life, and that mistakes are going to happen. Now, I'm not going to say sexual assault is a mistake. Sexual assault is a crime. Sexual harassment is a crime. We deal with that when the evidence shows that that happens. The story that we need to tell is West Point as a developmental institution. So if we take the cheating scandal as an example, it is true that we had cadets cheat on an exam, but it's also true that they were held accountable and they were developed through that system that we have in place, which requires an enormous amount of work to bring them back into good standing in the Corps of Cadets. And my experience is when they go through these special leader development programs related to a particular character issue under the tutelage of a member of the profession for about a 6-month period, they come out stronger, with stronger character when they come out of that program than obviously when they entered. So I think the story we need to tell more is that we do have these incidents. cadets are human beings. They are going to make errors in judgment. They are going to do things that are not right. But we need to use that as a learning opportunity and a developmental opportunity to get them where we need them to be by the time they graduate. And so all of our programs in character development, in health and holistic fitness, primary prevention, leadership competencies are all oriented to trying to reduce the prevalence of these behaviors that break trust in the organization. Sometimes I think we could, based on your observations, do a little better on the communication of what we're doing there.
Thanks very much.
I'm going to go over to my far right behind the podium here.
Thank you, ma'am. Major Ben Flores, U.S. Army Pacific. This question's for General Brito. So we're talking a lot about talent management, which is important, but officer promotions still rely upon the OER, which is, as we know, senior rater block check and 2 to 3 sentences by that senior rater, and that controls your fate. So with that in mind, sir, are there any initiatives to revamp the OER to better capture KSBs and talent attributes for the purpose of promotions?
Sure, I'm not tracking any hard initiatives right now, but I personally have been part of that discussion. I would offer up to you that the senior rater can address those KSBs in their verbiage. Yeah, you have 4 to 5 lines, but something well written, you can address that as well. I also understand there's some concern, and I've grown up in the Army just like you are, on blockings that should be reinforced in a concrete way in the narrative that the commander, the senior rater does right. I see your point, and yes, I have personally been part of discussions to look at that. It won't be a very quick change, but it is one that we should address, as you mentioned, to really identify the talent that needs to be managed. One thing I feel pretty comfortable on, and that I wanted to say seniors like me, I'll say more seasoned leaders are really looking at, by name where we can, the talent that this person can do this skill set and help him or her along that respective path and look through the obstacles that you just mentioned that could be, real or perceived in some cases, to make it better for the talent we need in our Army. But I'm glad you bring that up and continue to bring up those things because we listen and change, just like we did with this OER system as well, to include the NCOR evaluation. So thanks for your concern.
Thank you, sir.
And
Yep.
that leads to a question for the whole panel that came from the audience earlier, which is thinking about how do we incentivize the development of character in the Army? We can say it's a requirement, we can say it's your duty, but how do we actually go about incentivizing it? I think promotion boards is one of those pieces. Start with you, sir.
I guess at the value of the first seat, you get the first question, right? Well, you know, I would really hope it's something that you don't have to put money against. But I think as someone comes up and showing the profession, the pride that comes with wearing a uniform, to provide that they're going through your EIB or your medical skills badge, and I got it, or the pride of going through competitions like the best squad soldiers that we recognized just the other night, that incentivizes being a professional, being an Army profession. A good, solid training when you achieve something. I'm learning the book, I grab my rifle, I earn expert. That incentivizes being a strong profession. Or when a soldier gets a letter from a mom, says, hey, thanks for taking care of my soldier while deployed on this training exercise. It's intangible, that incentivizes being a profession. And when you walk them through the airport, thanks for your service, you look sharp in your uniform. Not scientific, that incentivizes the profession. I'll share with my peers here.
I think that we need to incorporate a leadership characteristic and quality that is that of empathy. And that will allow, I think, a better appreciation of the challenges that all leaders have faced and share that with a junior person as they're going through the process to incentivize that what they're doing is part of the process of becoming a leader and serving in a challenging profession, but a noble profession. I think the best things that I've received from leaders is their sharing of their shortcomings or challenges or setbacks. It is something that we all share, I think, up here. I mean, it's part of the Army experience, it's part of life experience. You're going to experience setback, and how you deal with it in a way that you don't let it linger or don't let it affect the way that you view your profession I think is incumbent upon us to set that example. It's a challenge because setback is, by its nature, not fun. And sometimes it's physical setback, and we have to deal with that on the battlefield of the enemy having a better day than us. And your subordinates will see what that setback does and how you deal with it. Or it's your personal setback of your career or other things that happen. But I do believe if we don't model that, then there's really no incentive for others to see that, hey, that leader or that individual who has achieved a level of expertise and position, and they struggle with some of the challenges, and they are rewarded still, and it is something that is acknowledged as part of our professional ethos, then I think that we miss an opportunity to reward that.
You know, there are incentives out there, absolutely. And it may not come with an immediate rank of promotion right now, but increased level of responsibility. And it doesn't take much, but just to volunteer, right? When I look at the inside, like for example, the 18th Airborne Corps, no better chance for you to prove your competency and your thirst for increased responsibility than going to jump master school and owning an aircraft with 100 paratroopers on it, right? If you want to go down to any of our armored divisions and you want an opportunity to change how we fight and train some of the most lethal formations, go be a master gunner. We have opportunities in our Army right now that are incentive-based to allow you to be not just a professional, but a skilled professional. Somebody, when they walk down the sidewalk and they look at, like, that person right there, I know is a skilled professional, right? Right, wrong, or different. When you graduate Ranger School, people expect more from you. When you graduate Sapper School, people expect more from you. It's not a little piece of, just a piece of cloth on your shoulder. You embody a lot of values, a lot of character, right? From the development of just yourself while you step forward and said, I want more responsibility.
So incentives in the area of character are kind of treacherous ground because really when you think about a person of good character, they're doing the right thing at the right time for the right reason and motivation, whether anybody's looking or not. And so by providing an incentive to do that, it takes it from the intrinsic mode to the extrinsic mode, and it becomes difficult to know why they're really doing or behaving in a particular way. Now, having said that, especially early in the process for young professionals, I think it's really important to reward or at least acknowledge the types of behavior that demonstrate the character we need for our profession. And I don't even think that this has to be over the top in terms of recognition. Sometimes you know that somebody did the harder right instead of the easier wrong. Just walk up to them and say, thank you. I respect you for that. If you're a leader, how are you responding to bad news? That is the truth. Are you shooting the messenger, or are you saying, thank you for telling me the truth so we can get this particular issue fixed? Sometimes the quiet encouragement is just as powerful as a piece of ribbon on the uniform, especially for somebody who is aspiring to be a member of full standing in the profession. So I think that there's a lot of ways that we can incentivize good character. And then I think it's probably worth mentioning on evaluation reports. If we believe that this is important to our profession, then let's talk about it when we recognize excellence in character and capture it on paper and make sure that they are known and acknowledged for their good character within the profession.
Can I make another highlight? Because I think that's so important. And what I was alluding to with my perspective about empathy, and the doctor highlighted it very clearly. And I want to make a recommendation. There's a great book by Robert Brooks called The Road to Character. And what he speaks of in there is exactly this different view, this different perspective between objective measurements of value versus not subjective, but inverse. And what he talks about are two things. He talks about resume values, and the other values that he talks about are eulogy values. the resume values are what we all want, right? We want to be able to be saying that we achieved this when we were in our last job, or this particular award or that particular type of accolade. But our resume, our utility values are those that we want to be truly remembered for. That we were caring, that we made a difference, that behind the scenes, we made things happen where people really didn't know, but it was important. And I think that we have to struggle with that, and we have to figure out ways that in our life and leaders that we're just not focused on those resume values, because they're inversely proportional. The hard work or the burning midnight oil gets you the objective, gets you those resume values. But to get to the actual values that we care about and the character that we're trying to build, you almost have to have an inverse relationship with things. It's not linear, it's nonlinear. You have to truly succeed, you have to fail. You don't realize that you're doing the best on the top of the mountaintop. It's when you're in the valley. And those types of characteristics and those values, I think, are important, that we need to be able to acknowledge both of them. And it just doesn't come across on an evaluation form, but it is something that is part of our responsibility to communicate that as part of our counseling and as our feedback.
One quick add, if I may.
Yeah, please.
We mentioned families in the beginning. I'm very comfortable that our senior leaders in the Army, all of us, take that seriously, programs we can do for our families' quality of life. And I'll also add, outside of professional military education paths, some opportunities, internships, fellowships, work with industry, other things that just give professional opportunities to our force. And it's just a great thing. And there's not too many, I think in a civil society, you won't find the GI Bill, tuition assistance, and other things that our soldiers can leverage as well. So make some investments in all of them.
Mm-hmm. This question goes to all of our panelists, and it's a more challenging question. So what do you think are some of the most significant threats to the Army's professional identity? And maybe we'll go in the reverse order. So I'll start with you, Dr. Peterson.
I'll respond. So I think there's a couple. One of the major tensions for the Army profession is this tension between the identity of a profession versus the identity of a bureaucracy. And the Army is both, and the Army needs to be both. We are a large organization that has to manage a lot of resources, and so it takes a bureaucracy to make that happen. So I'm not anti-bureaucracy until it chokes out the profession. When the bureaucracy becomes more important and we're more about compliance instead of judgment, when we're more about systems than we are about people, when we're more about process than we are about leadership, when we're more about task than we are about purpose, then I think we start getting into trouble. And the Army has been here before. And we just need to be conscious that if we're not careful, the bureaucracy will expand and continue to grow until it just chokes the life out of the profession. And so I think we need to be on guard for that.
I want to expand on a couple words you use, and I've heard used a little bit earlier, sir. Commitment versus compliance, right? If you look in our recent challenges we've had over the last couple of years as far as what the priorities are, and kind of making sure that we're actually delivering readiness to the combatant commander, the kind of what Forces Command does, right? It's warfighting, that number one focus area. When General Garrett was the Force Com commander, we had this thing called gated training strategy, right? It's like train to this little level, then validate with the live fire, then go the next block with the higher echelon and do live fire. And it was like a rush to get from live fire to live fire to live fire to get to the combat training center and do a brigade live fire. And what we saw over a couple of years is we atrophied where it mattered at the point of contact. We have to be able to win the first fight, and that win the first fight isn't always just an young infantryman at the point, right? It's pick an MOS, pick a career field. We were atrophying those necessary skills to actually fight and win. So when General Garrett assessed FORSCOM in that environment, we moved to a foundational training strategy, because that was really compliance, right? I got to get to here, I got to get to there. I'm reporting. It's no longer subjective T, it's objective based. That's how we're measuring it. But here we're going to do foundational training strategy. I'm going to give more time to subordinate command teams to get the necessary reps and sets at the squad platoon level to really build lethality, because those are the people that are going to figure it out. That's a lot of trust there. That's kind of like the element of mission command, right? I'm going to trust, think that an ACOM commander thing, I'm going to trust junior leaders to figure out this important dynamic of squads and platoons. We'll figure that at a higher echelon of collective proficiency later. So that's more of a commitment. Like, that's subjective. Like, my people are good enough to fight and win at night, right? That commitment versus compliance. So I think that's kind of showing you a vignette there between a gated training strategy and a foundational training strategy. Really what it takes is courage. Courage to change when it's necessary to do so.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with both of them more. Both Dr. and Command Sergeant Major highlighted a point, and I'm just going to provide a corollary to that. It's not necessarily about the tension between profession and bureaucracy. I think it's a tension between the profession and a businessization or a over-analytical approach to looking at aspects of what we do as an Army and conflating that we can better optimize certain characteristics or capabilities. And that is, in the halls of AUSA, I may be, speaking ill of those that are here from industry, but there's a lot that we gain from industry, but there are certain things that we don't need to gain from industry or don't need to gain from business because it's not inherently the same thing to consider. Now, I'm not talking about supply chain management. I'm not talking about our fail-fast software improvements that we're trying to do. Those are all great things that we will definitely inculcate into our Army and make sure that they make us better. But there are certain things that we can't look towards and focus, and I know it is part of our professional development, but we can't be overly driven by data analytics to help us make decisions that are inherently human and inherently values-based. So we just have to make sure we thread that needle and we balance that equation, even at the lowest levels, because it can be pushed down and there can be this perspective that we're looking for efficiency, we're looking for an optimization aspect of it. And it does come from the Pentagon sometimes, and it does have history in formation or ideas like even as far back as McNamara and the whiz kids of trying to really make an optimized department. But we have to fight that because our profession and the civilians that participate in it have to make sure that they are inherently making the profession a better capable warfighting organization, not the other way around.
I would say the speed and reach of social media is something we always have to pay attention to, and our Army will deal with it well. And not necessarily a risk, but a necessity is a budget that we would always have to maintain current readiness, but yet focus on future investments and future readiness as well.
A question for Mr. Diaz. So you have spoken to the professionalism of the Army civilians, and the reality is that a lot of soldiers may not interact with senior Army civilians. So how do we build that connective tissue between the civilian corps and those in uniform?
Well, that's a great question, Kate. And I think that we have ways that are built into our professional military education. I was not really aware of the Armed Forces Staff College that we have at Leavenworth and the great work that is done by GS level, mid-grade to more senior grade GS, and their integration and consistent focus and working with uniform and civilian level leaders at the lower echelons and bringing into account, and I sat through a class with them, and they talk about how they at their level are dealing with some of the challenges of working with uniform leaders who don't really know them or don't understand them. And I think that that's foundational at the installation level. Sometimes earlier on you have an interaction if you're interacting with some of the garrison support activities or some of the other types of logistics resourcing that has a significant amount of civilians. I think it's incumbent upon commanders to set up opportunities to do so. And I think that that's going to be critical as we look at the implementation of strengthening the Army profession, is how we actually codify and have commanders and leaders brief back or part of their training briefs or part of their professional development demonstrate the reality of how they're doing this and how they're operationalizing it. Otherwise, it will just be esoteric and it'll be something we talk about on panels versus actually being done in side by side where there are civilians and soldiers working together to solve tough Army problems. And I'm very cognizant that all the tough problems happen at echelon. They don't just happen, at your level and you think everything else is easy, because we've all gone through that echelon and we know that we dealt with tough problems. I think that pairing at that early on level is going to be the way that we can define and codify what it means to be a civilian professional. And there can be an understanding from sergeants and lieutenants what that means before they become generals and sergeants major.
I'll pose this next question to General Brito and to Dr. Peterson. So as we've discussed, the professional understanding of the way that war is changing and that modern war is being fought, the discourse around that needs to develop perhaps among those in uniform. You mentioned the revitalization of the branch magazine, but what are some of the other mechanisms or partnerships that the Army is exploring on how to build this professional dialogue on what modern war looks like?
There's a great partnership across the Army, not just with TRADOC. As a matter of fact, you see a partnership here between TRADOC and Forces Command, working closely with all the other commands as well. Army Futures Command focused on our future. But professional discourse with other organizations outside the military, academia and others, to help understand what the character of war, what may change in the future. And I would also offer maybe a little more elementary to that is just us. Our way we attack training, the way we address training, the way we develop training scenarios, gets at all of that as well. I'm not going to say it's simple, but the scenario that could be developed to drive our combat training center rotation can show those threats that will be faced in the future force. It can showcase the capabilities that we may be experimenting on. And then our brick and mortar professional discussion to include distance learning at every echelon can be adapted to address those things. No different than many of us who've been in for more than a couple of years have seen throughout the respective echelons of training. But definitely an Army team fight, all three components. And as I mentioned, we can pull in academia as well to help us see and understand that better. And the professional discourse that might come through some of the professional writing programs also helps us get us all of that. So I think it's pretty exciting. And I know we're going to achieve it.
Dr. Peterson?
So when I think about this challenge, I think about one of the key aspects of any profession, but particularly the Army profession, is this idea of professions creating new knowledge for situations that they haven't even experienced yet. So essentially, we're preparing for the unknown. And we have lots of thoughts about what future war may look like, how the technology will impact the war, how politics, culture, all these different impacts on war. But the truth is, we really don't know exactly how it's going to play out. And it almost never plays out the way we think it will. And so, as a profession, what we need to do is continually apply the knowledge that we've gained through experience and try to extrapolate what that's going to look like in an unknown future. That is incredibly difficult to do. And in order to do that well, we have to do that collectively as a profession, because none of us are as smart as all of us. I mean, it's a little colloquialism, but it's really true. And then the only way that we as a group of professionals can communicate these ideas and build on these ideas is through this notion of professional communication, whatever form that takes. That communication can be writing in journals, it can be blogging, it can be writing in any number of sources that are widely read by people in the military. But I do believe that that is a defining aspect of professions. And so we have to somehow figure out how to harness all the great knowledge that is scattered throughout the profession and bring it into a forum where we can talk about it, refine it, and better prepare ourselves for that uncertainty. And just the process of doing that helps us to be able to better react to those things that we didn't anticipate. It makes us more agile, it makes us better thinkers, makes us better communicators, and all of that helps us be better leaders within this profession.
So I'll open up a question to the whole panel. So you all have served in uniform in peacetime and in wartime. And right now we are thankfully at a lull. What opportunity is there in peacetime to develop and incentivize professionalism? And then what are some of the opportunities for professional growth that you've seen during a wartime footing? So we'll start with you, sir.
Sure. I would argue, and maybe just a little old school thought, training, leadership development at all times. And you can be very innovative with that. You mentioned wartime, not that they give you, peacetime, not that it gives you more time to do it, but it may. You may have an opportunity to, let me take my Bradley gunnery range and be innovative in the way I address things. So those are opportunities where you can leverage time. But the value of standards-based training, discipline and standards, professional discourse, writing opportunities, training development, all of which have been addressed in some of the questions today, you need to continually address that. And it may make it easier, perhaps a bad term, that when you are deployed and you are fighting, you have that first layer of readiness. You have that trust that is built. You have that competence that we need. And agile leaders that can do things in ambiguity and just survive and bring our soldiers back. So there's a clear nexus between those two windows. But a very fair question. Thank you.
Mr. Diaz?
I think what's very clear for us, for the civilian professionals, we're going to double down on education. We're increasing the throughput for our fellows and fellowships in areas of not only machine learning but artificial intelligence. We've trained over 150 this past year executives in that, and some great universities here on the East Coast. We're going to increase it to the West Coast. So we've had at University of North Carolina, we've had our executives go there. We're also going to increase out in the West Coast and Stanford to get more fellowships. And then we're also going to push to increase the throughput at PME for our civilians. I know that there's a perception maybe you want to have a firewall between the education, but I think at a certain point, and we want to push that a little bit lower, where there's an integration to the earlier question, integration of the professional military education between civilians and military, so they form that not only a common understanding of what it means to be a professional, but form those relationships early. So just like we're all the benefactors of lifelong relationships and connections, that you can form those between civilian and military professionals as well.
So to be real quick on this one, because I think General Brito really summed it up very well. Peacetime, be brilliant at the basics, master the fundamentals. And war, we have an opportunity to experiment, right? That's where you see a ton of innovation. And think about a young sergeant who was a farmer in World War II who welded some teeth on the front of a tank to get through some hedgerows in Normandy, to a young leader in CENTCOM who came up with a good idea of a rhino on the front of a vehicle to defeat EFPs, right? There's an opportunity there to build on the profession, to experiment, to really outpace our adversary. That's the kind of difference between the two, I think, as far as like building on the profession.
So it's interesting, this notion of like a peacetime or a lull and then combat operations. I mean, a very wise brigade commander that I worked for at one point said, Peterson, there's preparation and then there's execution. And so you're always preparing for whatever it is you need to execute. And so part of it is just a mind shift that we're always preparing, and that lends a sense of urgency to what it is that we're preparing for. One specific thing that I think is worth considering is an application of our risk management doctrine to the idea of risk to the profession. And so we're very good at talking about risk to the mission. We're very good about talking about risk to the force. But what is the risk to our profession? So as we approach different events, what are the moral, ethical risks that we are going to have to confront? What are the risks associated with treating each other with dignity and respect? And as we look around the environment right now, it seems like the demands on the Army in really a preparation phase are increasing. There's challenges with manning units at 100%, and so our manning levels are going down. So this is clearly an environment of doing more with less. And then we have modernization, We have different missions that we have to be prepared for. So this, if we're not careful, this is the type of environment that can lead to ethical fading. It can lead to moral disengagement, and we can find ourselves in a situation where we want to meet expectations, but it becomes very difficult to do so. And so there's temptations to take shortcuts. And when we start taking shortcuts, then we start undermining trust. And when we lose the currency of our trust, then it's really difficult to call ourselves a profession at that point. So I think it might be worth considering that we expand the application of our risk management. Don't neglect risk to mission and risk to force, but expand it to risk to the profession.
All right, so I'll combine a couple of these questions into one last question, and then I'll have our panelists close us out today. So thinking through the Army's vision of its own mission, how best do we communicate that to incoming soldiers? And one of the real bright spots of the Army is the fact that we are pulling from all parts of society, geographically distributed. We're pulling folks from all different backgrounds. How do you present that common mission to all soldiers who are coming in? So we'll start with you, General Brito.
Sure. I'm sure my distinguished panel members have some to add, but I'll share one aspect. And as you mentioned, all walks of life, all corners, all territories, all states coming into the United States Army. I'll focus in this case just on initial basic training, at all our respective places, and I'll focus on Fort Jackson in this case. As you said, we're going to make a soldier when he or she comes in. But I would share showing the value of the U.S. flag on your shoulder and what's behind the U.S. Army, and becoming part of the Army culture, regardless of where you came from, your station in life. So we actually have done some changes in the very beginning of basic training, and have seen the value over the last year or so of not doing the shark attack, where you scare someone to death and they don't want to be a soldier, but yet making them a soldier and understanding the dignity and respect that comes behind wearing a uniform, the importance of Army culture. You know, Dr. Barry had to lead, but the sharing the Army history and what it's been like for 248 years and how you are now part of that and contributing to that. So the importance of just the Army in the very beginning, in those 2 weeks, and some of the training, where not so much individually based, but you are now operating with a team member and a squad. So when you graduate, Kate, you're my battle buddy, and that's important. So that culture is there from the beginning, and I can expand more, but the same for our officers. But I'd like to share some stage time with the team here, but that's important and has made a difference. Mm-hmm. And then when the parents see them graduate, and the pride in their uniform and the pride of the soldier, putting on their beret, even though it might be crooked in the beginning, that's okay. That has also, that bond we need with Reconnected to America. Thanks.
Yeah.
Well, thanks. I spoke a little bit about the multiple entree points that the individuals become career professionals, civilian professionals in our Army. And I do think we have to be thoughtful in how we bring them each on and what that means and what they need in that time period, which is so crucial, just like a basic combat training soldier, and that, you know, bringing them on and ensuring that you're showing them what right looks like, you're incorporating and inculcating the values as quickly as possible, you're reinforcing them through multiple situations that you're putting them in. I think it's so important we do the same thing. Otherwise, we can have a tangent of our civilian professionals different than what we have for our expectation of how we assess our military professionals. To that point, I think it's incumbent upon the leaders who are in those positions to speak about what it means early and often to those individuals. When I spoke to the SCSs this morning, I said, you know, there's a civilian creed. Did you all know that? I know that we have a soldier's creed, there's a civilian creed. And that's an important aspect because it is an internal mantra that we say and we value, but that's when we're speaking to each other or speaking, you know, internally. We have to model outwards that creed, and we have to model what it means to be a professional. And in the 21st century information environment, as we've alluded to up here, you could have a significant amount of successes, but just have one failure, whether it's tied to, you know, improper resourcing or improper negative behavior and those types of things. So it is so important that our civilian leaders own up to their responsibility as being professionals, and they model it and they speak to it just as much as we hold our uniform leaders to be in front of the formation and speaking to and about being a professional.
This will defend. Since 14 June 1775, we've been defending an ideal, ink on paper, not a monarch, not anything else, but an ideal, right? Our culture, our way of life, and that's what makes us so great, right? So I think when young men and women join our Army, they're signing up to defend that, right? To be a part of that, part of what makes us great and our society so great. So I think we can never lose sight of that.
It's funny, I have written down here, this will defend. That's like, that is the inspirational message that we need to communicate, and there is so much worth defending. And I think we should take pride in that. At the individual level, I think we should communicate to young men and women that the Army profession is a place where you can flourish as an individual. You'll be part of a team that can flourish and do great things, and that you are part of a profession that is standing in the gap and defending these ideas that are written down in our Constitution. And they need to realize this is the only Army in history that takes an oath to a set of ideas in a Constitution. The only one. And that is being part of something special. So when you join the Army to become a member of the profession, you are becoming part of one of the most unique organizations in the history of the world, with an incredible mission, an incredibly important contribution to everything that our ideals stand for. So I think we need to communicate that frequently and often and not shy away from it at all.
All right, I'm going to give each of our panelists about 2 minutes to give us any parting thoughts you have. So, Dr. Peterson, we'll start with you and work our way down.
This is just a little bit of a continuation of what I was just talking about, which is I think that the Army is uniquely positioned right now to do a great service for our nation beyond just our warfighting and defending capability. I think we are at a point where the United States Army can be an institution that shows and demonstrates to America that there are trustworthy institutions in this nation that you can count on. We all know that trust is going in the wrong direction on all institutions, including our own. The luxury that we have is that trust in our institution is still very high. But let's get it moving in the other direction. Let's demonstrate through our own actions and our readiness and the way we communicate with America that you can trust us to do what you expect us to do. That's to defend our nation, and that's to take care of your sons and daughters as we develop them into the best human beings they can be. And so I think we have a unique opportunity in history to for the Army to demonstrate to America what right looks like in an important institution in this country.
Sergeant Major Holland?
Sure. Just one quick message. For those in the room, for those watching or who are yet to watch, go on your training calendar and block off this little block here and say you receive professional development. Right? Make sure you count for that today. And in the future, if you're watching this times yet to come, leader development never stops. It doesn't matter where you're at in our Army, right? It's not just in the training base, but it's also the people who train our soldiers. We still have a responsibility to train our leaders to really develop the profession of arms. Never forget that.
Great, thanks. It's been my honor to be a part of this great panel. I'll talk about two different general areas. The first one is to reinforce what Dr. Peterson and Sergeant Major Holland has said in more of a larger context, that our Army really has always been an institution for the betterment of our nation. It's built into our DNA, I think, and whenever there's tough problems, whether they're militarily tough, societally tough, the Army is always tackling them. Sometimes it takes us a little longer than we'd like, but we always get to the right answer, and we generally do it before definitely other institutions and lead our nation. So I think it's critically important that, as Dr. Peterson said, that we're at the precipice, or we're at a critical point where our Army can stabilize and harmonize what it means for our nation. Because we've talked a lot about this will defend, but I also think that an aspect of what we focused on, it's kind of a riff actually on Be All You Can Be. We're striving to always become a more perfect union. And I think that our Army is a contributor to that and not something that takes us in the wrong direction. And then the second point is, I think that this is, as we go deeper into the 21st century and we talk about warfighting and how warfighting is going to continue to evolve, we have to really be specific and identify what we require our uniform warfighters to do and what we need our Army civilian professionals to do. And I think, and it's probably a bad analogy, and I'm not trying to conflate the two, but we've spoken about this when we talk about AI or robotics. You know, what do we need robotics to do, and what can they do, and what do we uniquely need humans to do for decision-making, ethical prioritization, those types of things. I think we need to do the same thing when we look at the future capabilities of the Army and the profession. What do we need our warfighters to do, and what can we have? As I said, our civilians can be complementary. And as we go into things like cyber and space and other types of information dominance, do we truly need a uniformed individual to do that, or can a civilian professional do so? Because what we've spoken about today a lot is the changing character of war. But what we haven't spoken about is the changing nature of war. And the nature of war generally doesn't change. It hasn't changed over millennia, but I think we're also at a point where when we include things like robotics and AI and machine learning, there may be an actual fundamental change to the nature of war. So as we look at those dilemmas, we have to make sure that we have our Army civilians critically part of that discussion and maximize their potential. Thank you.
Last word.
And thank you, Kate. First, Mark, thank you for the warm opening, and thank you, Kate, as well, and my panel members. Hey, team, I guess simply put, and all the great marks have been said already, this professional discourse alone, I think, highlights that we all have a shared responsibility to be accountable and responsible for our Army profession, our professional Army. And I feel very confident that this continued dialogue, which is constant, and any investment we put in our asymmetric advantage, which is our people, will always make it so we can defend, fight, and win, and deploy. So thank you for this opportunity today. I'm looking forward to continuing to have a great Army with you.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Awesome. What do we work on again?
Always good.